Imagine Florence in the late 1470s. The city is a dazzling spectacle, the beating heart of the Renaissance, and at its center is one man, Lorenzo de Medici. But don't call him a king or a prince. Officially, he's just another citizen. In reality, he's Lorenzo the Magnificent, the undisputed master of Florence. How did he do it? His family, the Medici, had spent decades building a political machine. Lorenzo, charismatic and incredibly clever, perfected it. He wasn't a brute, he was a puppeteer. He made sure his friends and supporters won all the important elections, effectively controlling the government from behind the scenes. But he was also a showman. He won the people's hearts with spectacular festivals and celebrations that filled the streets with color and life. More importantly, he was the ultimate patron of the arts. Think of the greatest artists of the era: Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo. Lorenzo didn't just support them, he nurtured their genius. He filled Florence with breathtaking art and architecture, turning it into a city that glittered with creativity and culture. He was at the absolute peak of his power, a golden ruler in a golden age. But you know how it is. The brighter the light, the darker the shadows. And in the shadows of Lorenzo's magnificent Florence, a bitter resentment was growing. Enter the Pazzi family. They were old money, an ancient and proud Florentine family with a bank that was a major competitor to the Medici. They looked at Lorenzo and his family and saw nothing but upstart merchants who had stolen the power that should have been theirs. The power of the old aristocracy. For the Pazzi, it was deeply personal. Lorenzo was everything they wanted to be. Charming, popular, powerful, he outshone them at every single turn. His political machine wasn't just about controlling Florence. It was about actively sidelining families like the Pazzi, locking them out of the most important positions in the Republic. Every festival Lorenzo threw, every masterpiece he commissioned, was like a slap in the face to the Pazzi, a reminder of their own diminishing influence. Their pride was wounded, and their hatred festered like a poison. This local feud was about to go international. The Pazzi's anger caught the attention of a much greater power, a man with an empire to build, Pope Sixtus IV. Now, you might think of a pope as a spiritual leader, but Sixtus was also a king, a political strategist determined to expand the lands and influence of the papal states in central Italy. And who was standing in his way? Lorenzo de Medici. The two men were locked in a bitter rivalry. They clashed over territory, over alliances, over money. In a major power move, Pope Sixtus stripped the Medici Bank of its most prestigious role, being the official bank for the papacy. It was a huge blow to the Medici's finances and their pride. And who did the Pope give this incredibly lucrative account to? You guessed it. L. Though. L. Suddenly, the Pazzi's local ambition and the Pope's grand geopolitical strategy were perfectly aligned. The Pope saw a way to remove a major obstacle, and the Pazzi saw a way to finally crush their rivals and seize control of Florence. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, as they say. The simmering hatred of the Pazzi and the cold, calculated ambition of the Pope began to merge. In the hidden rooms of palaces in Florence and Rome, a secret plot began to form. This wasn't just about political maneuvering or financial competition anymore. It was becoming something far more sinister. The whispers grew louder, the plans more concrete. The goal was simple, and it was brutal. The complete and total elimination of the Medici. The stage was being set for one of the most infamous and bloody conspiracies of the Renaissance. The Pazzi Conspiracy was born, and the golden age of Florence was about to be stained with blood. We'll dive into the shocking details of that fateful day in our next video. You won't want to miss what happens when ambition and hatred collide inside Florence's most sacred cathedral. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into Renaissance history, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. See you next time. Have you ever heard of a conspiracy so audacious, so soaked in ambition and betrayal, that it involves a pope, a banker, and an archbishop, all plotting a double assassination in the middle of a cathedral? This isn't a movie script. It's a chilling, true story from the heart of Renaissance Florence. Welcome back to our channel, where today we're peeling back the layers of one of history's most dramatic plots, the Pazzi Conspiracy. Picture Florence in the late 15th century. It's the glittering jewel of the Renaissance, and at its very center are the Medici brothers, Lorenzo the Magnificent and his charismatic younger brother, Giuliano. They were more than just rulers. They were patrons of the arts, beloved by the people, and masters of a vast banking empire. But with great power comes great envy, and the Medici had made some very powerful enemies. At the heart of this web of intrigue were the Pazzi, another ancient and wealthy banking family. They saw the Medici not as leaders, but as rivals who had usurped their rightful place in Florence. The flame of this rivalry was fanned into a raging fire by one man in particular, Francesco de Pazzi. He was the head of the Pazzi Bank's branch in Rome, and he was consumed by a fiery, impatient ambition. He couldn't stand being in the Medici's shadow. He communicated his frustrations back to Florence, to his uncle, Jacopo de Pazzi. Jacopo was the patriarch, the old head of the family. Initially cautious, he was eventually persuaded that the only way to restore the Pazzi's honor and power was to cut the head off the snake or, in this case, the two heads of the Medici family. But the Pazzi knew they couldn't pull this off alone. They needed allies, and they found a very willing one in a man named Francesco Salviati. Had a personal vendetta against Lorenzo de Medici. He was an ambitious churchman who had his heart set on becoming the Archbishop of Florence, the most prestigious religious post in the city. But Lorenzo, wary of Salviati's connections to his rivals, blocked the appointment. This was a public humiliation Salviati would never forget. His hatred for the Medici festered, making him the perfect co-conspirator. Now, here's where the plot escalates from a local rivalry to an international conspiracy. Who was the ultimate authority in the church? The Pope himself, Sixtus IV. And Pope Sixtus had his own reasons for wanting the Medici gone. He and Lorenzo were locked in a power struggle over territory and influence in central Italy. Lorenzo had consistently thwarted the Pope's ambitions to expand the Papal States, creating a deep-seated animosity. So, when Francesco Salviati, now seething with resentment, came to the Pope with the Pazzi's plan, he found a receptive audience. Pope Sixtus IV appointed Salviati as the Archbishop of Pisa instead of Florence, a move that only deepened the insult. But behind the scenes, he became the secret, indispensable backer of the conspiracy. Did the Pope explicitly order the assassination? Publicly, he would later claim he wanted no bloodshed, but his actions spoke louder than words. He gave the plotters his blessing, his tacit approval to do whatever was necessary to remove the Medici from power. Everyone knew what necessary meant. The Pope's involvement elevated the plot, giving it a divine or at least a papal sanction. With the backing of the Church, the conspirators now needed military force. An assassination alone wouldn't be enough. They had to seize control of the city in the ensuing chaos. This is where Girolamo Riario, the Pope's own nephew and a ruthless captain of the papal armies, entered the picture. He was tasked with assembling mercenary troops. The plan was for these soldiers to be waiting at the gates of Florence, ready to march in and secure the city for the Pazzi and their allies the moment word came that the Medici brothers were dead. So, the pieces were all in place. You have the Pazzi's money and ambition, Salviati's personal hatred, the Pope's political power, and the papal army's muscle. The conspiracy was a toxic cocktail of Florentine politics, Roman intrigue, and military might. Their plan was brutally simple and shockingly bold. They needed to kill Lorenzo and Giuliano at the same time. If one brother survived, he would undoubtedly rally the people and unleash a terrible vengeance upon them. The assassinations had to be simultaneous, public, and decisive. They needed a moment when both brothers would be together, their guards down, in a crowded place. After considering several options, including a banquet, they settled on the most sacred and public venue imaginable: the great Cathedral of Florence, the Duomo, during High Mass on Sunday, April 26, 1478. The signal for the assassins to strike would be the elevation of the host, the most solemn moment of the Catholic Mass. At that very instant, as the bells rang and the congregation bowed their heads in prayer, daggers would be drawn. It was a plan of incredible sacrilege, combining holy ritual with cold-blooded murder. The conspirators believed that in this moment of divine worship, the Medici would be at their most vulnerable. 2 professional soldiers were initially hired to kill Lorenzo, but when they learned the assassination was to take place inside the cathedral, they backed out. Their warrior code, it seems, drew a line at committing murder on holy ground. In a fateful decision, their place was taken by 2 priests. These men, perhaps believing they were acting on the Pope's will, had no such qualms. Francesco de Pazzi himself, along with another conspirator, took on the task of killing Giuliano. As the day dawned, everything was set. The Archbishop Salviati and his men were preparing to seize the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of government. The papal army was creeping closer to the city walls. Inside the Duomo, the assassins mingled with the unsuspecting crowd of thousands, their daggers hidden beneath their cloaks. The Medici brothers arrived, unaware they were walking into a trap. Lorenzo was there, but Giuliano, feeling unwell, was initially hesitant to attend. Francesco de Pazzi and another conspirator went to the Medici palace themselves to fetch him famously, putting an arm around him on the walk to the cathedral, a gesture that seemed friendly, but was actually a chilling way to check if he was wearing a protective vest under his clothes. He wasn't. The Mass began. The tension must have been unbearable for those who knew what was coming. The choirs sang, the prayers were read, and then came the moment. The bell rang for the elevation of the host. As Lorenzo bowed his head, the 2 priests lunged at him. One only managed to inflict a minor wound on his neck. Lorenzo, a skilled fighter, reacted instantly, drawing his own sword, wrapping his cloak around his arm as a shield, and fighting his way through the chaos to the safety of the sacristy, where his friends barricaded the heavy bronze doors behind him. But for Giuliano, there was no escape. As he stood, Francesco de Pazzi and Bernardo Bandini Baroncelli fell upon him with savage fury. He was stabbed 19 times. The attack was so frenzied that Francesco de Pazzi, in his bloodlust, accidentally stabbed his own thigh. Giuliano de Medici, the handsome, popular Prince of Florence, lay dead on the cold marble floor of the cathedral, his blood pooling around him. The plot had failed. One brother was dead, but the other, Lorenzo, was alive. The scream of treason echoed through the cathedral. The plan to seize the government also fell apart. Archbishop Salviati, attempting to take the government palace, was recognized and trapped. The people of Florence, far from rising up to support the Pazzi, were horrified. They loved the Medici. When they learned that Lorenzo was alive and that Giuliano had been murdered, their grief turned to rage. The city erupted not in support of the Pazzi, but in a furious, citywide manhunt for the conspirators. The Florentines, chanting yeah, the cry referring to the balls on the Medici coat of arms, hunted down anyone associated with the plot. The retribution was swift and brutal. Francesco de Pazzi, wounded and betrayed, was dragged from his bed and hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. Archbishop Salviati, still in his clerical robes, was hanged right beside him. Jacopo de Pazzi was caught and executed. Within days, over 80 people connected to the conspiracy were killed, their bodies displayed as a grim warning. The Pazzi conspiracy was a catastrophic failure for its architects. It was meant to destroy the Medici, but instead, it cemented their power for generations. Lorenzo, now the sole leader, emerged from the tragedy not weakened, but stronger, his authority unquestionable. He was no longer just a powerful banker. He was Lorenzo the Magnificent, the survivor, the avenger of his beloved brother, and the undisputed master of Florence. The failed plot, born from a potent mix of envy, ambition, and papal politics, had the exact opposite of its intended effect, ensuring the very dynasty it sought to obliterate would define the golden age of the Renaissance. Have you ever heard the saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer? For the powerful Medici family of Renaissance Florence, this wasn't just a proverb, it was a matter of life and death. But what happens when your enemies are already in your inner circle, plotting in the shadows? This is the story of a conspiracy born from jealousy, ambition, and a thirst for power, a plot that would unfold in the most sacred of places and stain the marble floors of a cathedral with blood. Welcome to the Pazzi Conspiracy, one of history's most audacious and dramatic assassination attempts. For nearly a century, Florence had been under the unofficial rule of the Medici family. They weren't kings or dukes, but their immense wealth from banking gave them unparalleled influence. By the late 15th century, two brothers stood at the head of the family. Lorenzo, known as the Magnificent for his brilliant mind and patronage of the arts, and his younger, charismatic brother, Giuliano. They were the rockstars of the Renaissance, beloved by the people and masters of a city that was the cultural heartbeat of Europe. But with great power comes great envy, and the Medici had enemies. Chief among them were the Pazzi family. The Pazzi were old Florentine nobility, rival bankers who watched with bitter resentment as the Medici's star continued to rise while their own fortunes dwindled. They felt slighted, ignored, and pushed out of the city's power structure. Their patriarch Jacopo de Pazzi was a proud and angry man who believed his family deserved to rule Florence. This personal rivalry was the spark, but it would take a more powerful hand to fan it into the flames of conspiracy. That hand belonged to none other than the Pope himself, Sixtus IV. The Pope had his own reasons to despise the Medici. They had thwarted his ambitions to expand the Papal States, and he saw Lorenzo as a major obstacle to his political goals in Italy. The Pope, along with his nephew, Girolamo Riario, who was hungry for his own lordship, saw an opportunity in the Pazzi's hatred. They secretly met with Francesco de Pazzi, a hot-headed member of the family who was the treasurer in Rome. Together, they hatched a plan. It wasn't just about removing the Medici, it was a full-blown coup. The goal was simple and brutal: assassinate Lorenzo and Giuliano simultaneously, seize control of the government, and hand Florence over to a new regime friendly to the Pope. The conspiracy grew, drawing in others who held grudges against the Medici. One of the key players was Francesco Salviati, the Archbishop of Pisa. The Medici had blocked his appointment to the more prestigious Archbishopric of Florence, and he burned with a desire for revenge. With the backing of the Pope and the fury of the Pazzi, the plot was set. They just needed the right time and place to strike. The conspirators planned their attack for a grand banquet hosted by the Medici. It was the perfect setting. Lorenzo and Giuliano would be relaxed, surrounded by guests. But fate intervened. On the day of the banquet, Giuliano fell ill and didn't attend. The plotters were forced to postpone. A failed assassination attempt was unthinkable. They had to eliminate both brothers at once to prevent a swift and bloody retaliation. A new plan was needed, one that was even more daring, more so keen, and ultimately more succulacious. The new location. The Florence Cathedral. The magnificent Duomo. During High Mass on Sunday, April 26, 1478. It was Easter week, and the city's heart would be packed with thousands of worshippers. The brothers would surely be there, kneeling before God, unarmed and It was a monstrous idea to commit murder in God's house at the most sacred moment of the service. But for the conspirators, the ends justified any means. The sheer audacity of the act. They believed it would stun the city into submission. Each conspirator was assigned a role. Francesco de Pazzi and a professional killer named Bernardo Bandini de Baroncelli would be responsible for Giuliano. They were ruthless and determined. The task of killing Lorenzo, the main prize, fell to two priests, Antonio Maffei and Stefano da Baguno. The logic was chillingly simple. As priests, they could approach the brothers near the altar without arousing suspicion. The signal for the synchronized attack was chosen for its symbolic power. The ringing of the bells during the elevation of the host. The very moment the bread and wine are consecrated, representing the body and blood of Christ. As the city prayed, the assassins prepared to spill blood of their own. That Sunday morning, the air in Florence was filled with the sound of church bells. The Duomo was overflowing. As the conspirators took their positions, they realized something was wrong again. Giuliano was nowhere to be seen. He was still feeling unwell and had considered staying home. In a moment of chilling nerve, Francesco de Pazzi and Bernardo Bandini went to the Medici palace themselves. They greeted Giuliano warmly, joking with him, and convinced him to come to the service. On the walk to the cathedral, they put their arms around him, not as an act of friendship, but to check if he was wearing any armor or a sword beneath his clothes. He wasn't. They led him like a lamb to the slaughter. Inside the cathedral, Lorenzo and Giuliano knelt near the altar, separated by the crowd. The mass proceeded. The choir sang. Incense filled the air, and the congregation was lost in prayer. Then came the moment. The priest raised the host high, and the altar bells rang out through the cavernous space. It was the signal. Pandemonium erupted. Bernardo Bandini lunged at Giuliano, plunging a dagger deep into his chest. Giuliano staggered, his eyes wide with shock. Then, Francesco de Pazzi, consumed by a wild, terrifying frenzy, threw himself on the wounded man. He stabbed Giuliano again and again and again, with such savage force that he accidentally drove the dagger through his own thigh, inflicting a serious wound upon himself. In seconds, Giuliano de Medici lay dead on the marble floor in a rapidly expanding pool of his own blood. He had been stabbed 19 times. Simultaneously, across the chancel, the two priests made their move on Lorenzo. But they were men of God, not men of violence. Their attack was clumsy, hesitant. One priest grabbed Lorenzo's shoulder, and the other attempted to stab him in the throat. But Lorenzo the Magnificent was not just a politician. He was young, athletic, and sharp. He twisted away, the blade only grazing his neck. He instantly wrapped his cloak around his left arm to create a makeshift shield, drew his own sword, and parried their frantic attacks. His friends, including the famous poet Policiano, rushed to his side, forming a protective circle. They fought their way through the screaming, panicked crowd and bundled Lorenzo into the sacristy, slamming and bolting the heavy bronze doors, just as the assassins tried to follow. The most crucial part of the plot had failed. Lorenzo was alive. Outside the sacristy, the cathedral was in chaos. People were screaming, running, unsure of what had just happened. Some thought the roof was collapsing, but when they saw Giuliano's body, the truth spread like wildfire. The Pazzi had attacked the Medici. Blood had been spilled on sacred ground. Meanwhile, the second part of the coup was underway. Archbishop Salviati and a group of armed men went to the Palazzo Vecchio, Florence's town hall, with the aim of capturing the government. But his nerve failed him. He tried to act casual, but his trembling hands and shifty eyes gave him away. He tried to trap the city's leaders in a room, but they grew suspicious and barricaded themselves in. The archbishop's men, hidden while waiting for his signal, got trapped in another chamber. The government was alerted, and the palace guards were raised. The coup was falling apart. When the people of Florence learned that Lorenzo was alive and that the Pazzi had murdered his popular brother during Mass, their reaction was not the submission the conspirators had hoped for. It was pure, unadulterated rage. Cries of "Pal! Pal!" The rallying cry of the Medici, referring to the balls on their coat of arms, echoed through the streets. The Florentines were not shocked into inaction. They were ignited with fury. They saw the Pazzi not as liberators, but as sacrilegious traitors who had defiled their city and their faith. The revenge was swift and merciless. An angry mob descended on the Pazzi palace. Francesco de Pazzi, bleeding heavily from his self-inflicted leg wound, was dragged from his bed. Archbishop Salviati was captured at the Palazzo Vecchio. We know worse. They, along with several other conspirators, were hanged from the windows of the town hall, their bodies swinging gruesomely for all of Florence to see. The mob hunted down anyone associated with the plot. Jacopo de Pazzi, the old patriarch, managed to escape the city but was soon caught and brought back. He was tortured, executed, and his body was thrown into the Arno River. The city had spoken. Their loyalty was to the Medici. In the aftermath, Lorenzo the Magnificent proved his political genius. He survived not just the assassins' blades, but the political storm that followed. The Pope, furious at the failure of the plot and the execution of an archbishop, excommunicated Lorenzo and all of Florence and declared war. But Lorenzo, through brilliant diplomacy and a daring personal visit to his enemy, the King of Naples, managed to secure peace and save his city. The Pazzi Conspiracy, intended to destroy the Medici, had the opposite effect. It solidified their power beyond any doubt. Giuliano's death made him a martyr, and Lorenzo's survival made him a hero. He emerged from the crisis not just as Lorenzo de Medici, but truly as Lorenzo the Magnificent, the undisputed master of Florence. The failed plot marked the pinnacle of Medici power, a dramatic and bloody chapter that ensured their legacy would be etched into history forever. Last time, we left Florence in a state of chaos. Inside the Grand Duomo, Giuliano de Medici lay dead, brutally stabbed by the Pazzi conspirators, while his brother Lorenzo, wounded but alive, had barricaded himself in the sacristy. But the attack on the brothers was only the first part of the plan. The real prize was the city itself. As the tragic events unfolded in the cathedral, the second act of this bloody play began. Archbishop Francesco Salviati, one of the key ringleaders, had slipped away from Mass just before the violence erupted. Accompanied by a group of heavily armed mercenaries, he made a beeline for the Palazzo Vecchio, the heart of Florentine government. His mission was simple: seize the seat of power, capture the government officials, and declare the end of Medici rule. He probably imagined himself as the new master of Florence, the man who had freed the city from so-called tyrants. But history, as we know, rarely goes according to plan. When Salviati arrived at the palace, his mask of confidence began to slip. His nervous energy was palpable, and walking into the seat of government with a small army of armed toughs wasn't exactly subtle. The man he needed to deceive was the Gonfalonier of Justice, Cesare Petrucci, essentially the city's mayor. Petrucci was a shrewd and experienced politician, and more importantly, he was a staunch and loyal supporter of the Medici family. As Salviati and his men entered the palace, Petrucci immediately sensed that something was deeply wrong. The archbishop was stammering. His story about needing to see him on urgent papal business wasn't adding up, and the armed men lurking in the hallways. That was the final, glaring red flag. Petrucci wasn't just suspicious. He was certain this was a trap. Acting with incredible speed and decisiveness, he gave a signal. Suddenly, the clang of heavy metal echoed through the stone halls. The great doors of the Palazzo Vecchio were slammed shut and barred. Who's like that Archbishop Salviati and his men were no longer attackers. They were prisoners, trapped inside the very building they had come to conquer. The junta had become the hunted. Meanwhile, back on the streets, the patriarch of the conspiracy, the elderly Jacopo de Pazzi, was launching the public-facing part of the coup. He and his followers mounted their horses and galloped towards the Piazza della Signoria, right in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, where Salviati was now trapped. Jacopo was convinced that the people of Florence were chafing under Medici control, that they were desperate for a change. He believed they would see him as a liberator. Raising his sword to the sky, he cried out the word he thought would ignite a revolution. Libertà, libertà, libertà. Libertà. He expected the citizens to pour from their homes and workshops, to hail the Pazzi as heroes who had freed them from the grip of the Medici tyrants. He pictured a glorious parade, the people carrying him on their shoulders as the new father of the Republic. What happened next was one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in political history. Jacopo had not just misjudged the mood of the city. He'd misunderstood its very soul. News of the events in the Duomo was spreading like wildfire through the packed city streets. But the story the people heard wasn't one of liberation. They heard of a sacred mass desecrated by assassins. They heard of the beloved, handsome Giuliano de Medici, a young man known for his charm and generosity, being butchered on the cathedral floor. They heard that his brother Lorenzo, their Lorenzo il Magnifico, had been attacked and was fighting for his life. The reaction wasn't applause for the Pazzi. It was a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated rage. The Florentine people weren't resentful of the Medici. They were fiercely, protectively loyal to them. The Medici had brought peace, stability, and unprecedented prosperity and prestige to the city. They were patrons of the arts, champions of the people, and symbols of Florentine pride. This attack wasn't seen as a political move. It was a personal, sacrilegious assault on Florence itself. So, when Jacopo de Pazzi screamed liberty, the crowd screamed back. But they weren't echoing his call. Instead, a new chant rose from the depths of the angry mob, a sound that would have chilled Jacopo to the bone. They roared, "Pal! Pal! Pal!" Pal, which means bowls, was the rallying cry of the Medici supporters. It was a direct reference to the bowls, or pal, depicted on the Medici family's coat of arms. It was a defiant, furious declaration of loyalty. It meant, "We are for the Medici. Down with their enemies." In that moment, Jacopo de Pazzi must have realized his dream of a Pazzi-led republic had just died a very public and humiliating death. The people of Florence didn't just shout. They acted. An enraged mob, a terrifying sea of humanity, flooded the piazza and the surrounding streets. These weren't soldiers. They were ordinary citizen shopkeepers, artisans, blacksmiths, and farmers, and they were armed with whatever they could find. Butchers, knives, kitchen cleavers, blacksmiths, hammers, farming tools, and cobblestones ripped from the street. Their target was clear. Find every Pazzi, every conspirator, and make them pay for what they had done. The city of the Renaissance, the cradle of art and philosophy, transformed in an instant into a hunting ground. The mob, fueled by grief and a thirst for vengeance, began to systematically track down anyone associated with the plot. Lorenzo's supporters fanned out, pointing out the homes of known Pazzi allies. The attempted coup had failed. What followed was not a revolution, but a reckoning. A brutal, bloody purge that would see the conspirators meet fates far worse than they could have ever imagined. The fury of the Florentines had been unleashed, and it would not be satisfied until justice, in its most primitive and violent form, was served. And that's where we'll leave it for today. The initial plot has backfired spectacularly, and the city is baying for blood. Next time, we'll witness the grim and gruesome fates of Archbishop Salviati, Francesco de Pazzi, and the other conspirators as Florence exacts its terrible revenge. Friends, have you ever heard the story of a woman whose quest for vengeance was so swift, so cunning, and so utterly terrifying that it became the stuff of legend? This isn't a fairy tale. It's the incredible true story of Olga of Kiliu, a the 8th century princess who redefined the art of revenge. Our story begins in the year 945. Olga's husband, Igor of Kihigu, ruler of the Kievan Rus, was brutally executed by a tribe known as the Drevlians. They had grown tired of his excessive tribute demands and decided to make an example of him. After the gruesome act, the Drevlians, feeling confident, made a fatal miscalculation. Their prince proposed to marry Olga, hoping to absorb Kievan Rus into their own domain. They sent a delegation of 20 of their best men by boat to deliver the proposal. When the Drevlian envoys arrived, Olga greeted them with a seemingly gracious smile. "Your proposal is pleasing to me," she said. "Indeed, my husband cannot rise from the dead, but I desire to honor you tomorrow in the presence of my people. Go now to your boat and lie down in it with arrogance. In the morning I shall send for you, and you shall say, 'We will not ride on horses nor go on foot. Carry us in our boat.'" The Drevlians, flattered by this promise of great honor, did exactly as she said. The next morning, as they waited proudly in their boat, Olga's people came, lifted the boat onto their shoulders, and carried them into the city. But they didn't take them to the palace. They carried them to a deep trench that Olga had ordered dug the night before, and while the envoys were still in the boat, they were thrown, boat and all, into the pit. As they were being buried alive, Olga leaned over the edge and asked them, "Does the honor find you to your taste?" But Olga's vengeance was just getting started. She then sent a message to the Drevlians, saying, "If you truly desire me, send me your distinguished men so that I may go to your prince in due honor, for otherwise the people of Kiju will not let me go." Completely unaware of the fate of their first delegation, eagerly dispatched another group, this time consisting of their most important nobles and chiefs. When this new delegation arrived, Olga's hospitality took another sinister turn. She ordered a bathhouse to be prepared for her guests. "Wash yourselves and come to me," she told them. The Drevlian nobles, weary from their journey, happily entered the bathhouse. As soon as they were inside, Olga's men bolted the doors from the outside and set the entire wooden structure on fire. Not a single person escaped. She had effectively wiped out the Drevlian ruling class in one fiery stroke. Even then, she wasn't finished. Olga sent yet another message to the Drevlians. This time, she announced that she was coming to their capital, a city called Iskorosten, to hold a funeral feast for her deceased husband. "Prepare great quantities of mead in the city where you killed him," she commanded, "so that I may weep over his grave and hold a funeral feast for him." The still clueless, and perhaps thinking she had finally accepted their prince's proposal, complied. They brewed vast amounts of mead and awaited her arrival. Olga came with a small group of attendants, appearing as a grieving widow. She wept at Igor's tomb. And then the funeral feast began. She encouraged the Drevlians to drink, and they drank heavily, celebrating what they believed was their final victory. When they were thoroughly drunk and incapacitated, Olga gave a signal. Air soldiers who had been hiding nearby fell upon the 5,000 drunken Drevlians and slaughtered every last one of them. You might think that would be the end. But Olga's thirst for justice was absolute. The following year, in 946, she gathered her army and laid siege to the city that had harbored her husband's killers. The remaining Drevlians fought back bravely, and the siege dragged on for a year. The city would not fall, so Olga devised one final, brilliant, and terrifying plan. She sent a message into the city, offering peace. "Why do you persist in holding out? Say, ask it. All your other cities have surrendered to me and are paying tribute, but you would rather starve than submit." The exhausted citizens asked what she wanted. "I do not wish to impose a heavy tribute like my husband did," she replied. "I ask only for a small gift. Give me 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house." The Drevlians, overjoyed at such a small price for peace, quickly gathered the birds and sent them to Olga. They thought they had finally escaped her wrath. But that night, Olga instructed her soldiers to attach a piece of sulfur bound with small pieces of cloth to the leg of each bird. As dusk fell, they lit the claws and released the birds. The pigeons and sparrows, as birds do, flew back to their nest to the coops, the eaves, and the thatches of the wooden houses within in an instant, the entire city was engulfed in flames. There was nowhere to run. As the panicked citizens fled the burning city, Olga's soldiers were waiting. They captured the survivors, killing some and enslaving others to serve as tribute payers for the rest of their lives. And so, Olga of Kiju exacted a swift and terrible vengeance, not once, but 4 times over. She not only avenged her husband's death, but also secured the future of Kiev and Rus, and solidified her own power as a formidable ruler. Her story is a chilling reminder of the lengths one person will go to for justice, and the power of a brilliant, albeit ruthless, mind. She would later convert to Christianity and become a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church, but her early years as a vengeful pagan queen are what forged her into a legend. The blood had barely dried on the marble floor of the Florence Cathedral, but the city was already in an uproar. The Pazzi Conspiracy, a meticulously planned assassination meant to wipe the Medici family from the face of Florence, had failed. It had failed in the most spectacular, most catastrophic way imaginable for its orchestrators. Instead of a city liberated, Florence was a city enraged. Instead of a new republic, the old one was about to be reforged into something much stronger, centered around one man. Lorenzo de Medici. The conspirators had made a fatal miscalculation. They believed the people of Florence chafed under Medici rule, that they saw Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano as tyrants. They thought that by striking them down in the holiest of places on the holiest of days, they would be hailed as liberators. They could not have been more wrong. The Florentines didn't see a political assassination. They saw a sacrilegious butchery. They saw their city's peace shattered, God's house desecrated, and one of their own the handsome and beloved Giuliano, savagely murdered. As Lorenzo, wounded but alive, was whisked away to the safety of the Medici palace, the streets of Florence erupted. But the cries were not "Long live the Republic," as the Pazzi had hoped. The cries were "Pow, pow, pow, pow," the rallying cry of the Medici, referring to the bowls on their coat of arms. The mob wasn't hunting for Medici supporters. It was hunting for the Pazzi and their co-conspirators. The carefully orchestrated coup devolved into a citywide bloodbath, a brutal and swift act of public vengeance. Jacopo de Pazzi, the elderly patriarch of the family, managed to escape the city, but he didn't get far. He was captured, dragged back to Florence, and subjected to the mob-est fury before being formally executed and hanged from a window of the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of government. His nephew, Francesco de Pazzi, who had personally stabbed Giuliano with such ferocity that he wounded himself in the leg, was found hiding in his uncle's house. He was dragged naked through the streets and met the same fate, his body left dangling for all to see. The scene at the palazzo was grim and theatrical. One by one, the conspirators were captured and summarily executed. Archbishop Salviati, the man of God who had been a key player in the plot, was also hanged from a window. Still in his formal vestments, a grim legend says that in his death throes, he bit into the decaying corpse of Francesco de Pazzi, hanging beside him. Whether true or not, the story captured the sheer horror and rage of the moment. The Florentine government, far from embracing the conspirators, sanctioned the public's fury. The message was clear: an attack on the Medici was an attack on Florence itself. The aftermath was a gruesome public spectacle. Bodies dangled from the government palace for days. The Pazzi family was systematically destroyed. Their name was erased, their property confiscated, their coat of arms ordered to be chiseled off every building in Florence. It was a complete and utter damnatio memoria, a condemnation of memory. They were to be forgotten, their legacy reduced to nothing but a cautionary tale of treachery. For Lorenzo de Medici, this was a moment of profound transformation. He had entered the cathedral that Easter Sunday as the powerful but unofficial first citizen of Florence. He emerged as something more. The attack had not only failed to kill him, it had tragically eliminated his only rival for power within the family. His brother, Giuliano. Giuliano had been the golden boy, handsome, popular, and perhaps more universally liked than the more politically serious Lorenzo. With Giuliano gone, Lorenzo was now the sole, undisputed head of the family, the focus of all loyalty and sympathy. The public, horrified by the conspiracy, now saw Lorenzo not just as a political leader, but as a survivor, a martyr in waiting, the protector of their city's stability and honor. His wound became a symbol of his sacrifice for Florence. The brutal attack legitimized his power in a way that years of quiet political maneuvering never could. He was no longer just the head of the city's most powerful banking family. He was the embodiment of Florence itself, his survival intertwined with the survival of the Republic. But Lorenzo's trials were far from over. One of the main conspirators was Pope Sixtus IV himself. The Pope had greenlit the conspiracy, hoping to replace the Medici with his own more pliable allies. The execution of his Archbishop Salviati was an unforgivable insult. Enraged Sixtus did the most powerful thing a pope could do. He excommunicated Lorenzo de Medici and placed the entire city of Florence under an interdict. This was a spiritual and economic catastrophe. The interdict meant that no masses could be said, no sacraments administered, no Christian burials performed. It essentially cut off the entire city from God. Economically, it meant that any Christian monarch could seize Florentine assets and property abroad without consequence. For a city built on international banking and trade, this was a death sentence. The Pope didn't stop there. He formed a military alliance with the powerful Kingdom of Naples, and together they declared war on Florence. The city was now isolated, spiritually condemned, and facing invasion from the south. The Florentine Republic, weakened and terrified, looked to one man for salvation: Lorenzo. This was his greatest test. For over a year, the war dragged on, draining the city's coffers and threatening its very existence. Florentine forces suffered several defeats, and morale was plummeting. The city that had rallied so fiercely around Lorenzo was beginning to waver under the immense pressure. It was then that Lorenzo made the boldest gamble of his life. In the winter of 1479, without the formal approval of the Florentine government, he took a ship and sailed directly into the lion's den. The court of his enemy, King Ferrante of Naples. This was an act of incredible personal courage. Ferrante was known for his cruelty and his habit of keeping his enemies embalmed and dressed in their finest clothes in a personal museum. Lorenzo was placing his life directly in the hands of this ruthless monarch. For 3 long months, Lorenzo remained in Naples, a guest who was effectively a hostage. He used every ounce of his legendary charm, his wit, his intelligence, and his vast wealth. He wasn't just a politician, he was a humanist, a poet, a man of immense culture. He dazzled the Neapolitan court. He argued that the Pope's ambition, not Florence's actions, was the true threat to the peace of Italy. He reasoned that a strong, independent Florence was a better ally for Naples than a weak papal puppet state. He likely also used the power of the Medici Bank, offering generous financial incentives. Slowly, painstakingly, he won King Ferrante over. In early 1480, Lorenzo returned to Florence. Not in chains, but with a peace treaty. AID single-handedly ended the war. When he rode back into the city, the Florentines greeted him as a hero, a savior, the pater patriae, the father of the country. His reputation was now legendary. He had faced down assassins, defeated Pope, and charmed a hostile king into making peace. His authority, once informal and based on wealth and influence, was now absolute and unquestioned, forged in blood and diplomacy. The Florentine government, in gratitude, created a new council, the Council of 70, which was filled with Lorenzo's supporters and effectively gave him constitutional control over the state. He would rule Florence for the next 14 years, not as a prince or a duke with a formal title, but as Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo de Magnifici. This was the beginning of the High Renaissance in Florence, the city's golden age. Freed from political strife and with his power secure, Lorenzo unleashed his true passion. Patronage of the arts, he gathered around him the most brilliant minds of the age. Philosophers like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, poets like Poliziano, and artists who would define the era. He sponsored a young Michelangelo, treating him like a son and inviting him to live in the Medici palace. He commissioned works from Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and Verrocchio. Under his guidance, Florence became the undisputed cultural capital of the world. A new Athens, the Pazzi Conspiracy, intended to be the final, bloody chapter of the Medici story, had backfired into becoming its most important turning point. It was the brutal, violent foundation upon which the legend of Lorenzo the Magnificent was built. It transformed a political boss into a beloved leader, a banker into a statesman, and a patron into the architect of a golden age. That horrifying act of violence on Easter Sunday did not end the Medici rule. It cemented it, ensuring that the name of Lorenzo the Magnificent would be remembered for all time. Thank you so much for watching. The story of the Medici is filled with drama, power, and art, and it's a story we love telling. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next video. We'll see you next time.